Liang trudged through the forest, muttering under his breath. A war-scarred warrior in a worn leather cloak, his boots cracked and mud-stained, he looked entirely out of place in the serene surroundings. Birds chirped innocently in the canopy above, as though oblivious to the dark storm cloud hovering around him. He wasn't lost, at least not physically. He knew exactly where he was, and unfortunately, he knew exactly why he was there. "This is ridiculous," he mumbled to himself, shaking his head. "A warrior of my status, banished to a forest, to heal?" His voice dripped with sarcasm as he glared at the trees, almost daring them to respond. But, of course, they didn't. They just stood there, indifferent, swaying gently in the breeze as if mocking his plight. He wasn't used to the quiet, to the emptiness of nature's wide, sprawling silence. He longed for the clang of swords, the rush of battle, and, most of all, he missed Mei. Liang's scowl deepened at the thought of her. Mei, his love, his life, his very soul, lost to the same war that had marked him as both hero and exile. His heart ached with the emptiness that had filled it ever since she was gone, a void he feared would never heal. And the villagers' idea of a solution? Sending him into this forest, claiming it would heal his spirit. He wasn't even sure what that meant, but he'd run out of places to go and was tired of being met with sympathetic stares and pitying glances. "This is absurd," he huffed, wiping his brow as he pushed through a particularly dense patch of brambles. He yelped as a thorny branch snapped back, slashing across his cheek and snagging his cloak. He glared at the branch as if it had personally offended him. "Even the trees are against me." Just then, a squirrel scampered down a nearby trunk, pausing to stare at him with a curious tilt of its head. Liang stared back, narrowing his eyes at the small creature. The squirrel chittered, an almost taunting sound, as it watched him struggle with the thorny bush. "Oh, you think this is funny?" he grumbled, as if the squirrel would respond. The squirrel did respond, in its own way. It scampered up the branch that had slapped him, pausing to look back at him as though saying, "Look who's in my forest now." Then it vanished in a flash of fur and tail, leaving Liang muttering curses under his breath as he disentangled himself from the brambles that he finally broke free, patting down his cloak and smoothing his tangled hair, cursing the forest under his breath. A warrior, he reminded himself, a celebrated warrior, and here I am talking to squirrels and getting beat up by bushes. This place is cursed. But his scorn and self-pity evaporated the moment he stepped into a small clearing. In the center stood an ancient tree, far older than any he had seen in the forest. Its trunk was wide, gnarled, twisted like it had grown in constant conversation with the winds and storms of centuries past. Branches stretched out in every direction, adorned with leaves that shimmered with an unusual, almost ethereal light. He felt a strange tug in his chest, an urge to step closer. Before he knew it, Liang found himself standing at the base of the tree, one hand resting on its ancient bark. The rough, weathered surface felt oddly warm, alive in a way that no other tree did. And then, something happened. As his hand lingered on the bark, the leaves above began to shimmer more brightly. He felt a strange sensation, like a breeze flowing through his very soul, stirring memories he hadn't wanted to face. The leaves, once a pale green, began to shift, turning a deep, bruised purple, then to a sorrowful blue. He stared, mesmerized, as the colors swirled and changed, each shade capturing a different emotion, a torrent of feelings he'd buried deep. What is this?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. The leaves above shimmered brighter, reflecting his memories back at him. He saw flashes of Mei's face, her smile, the way her laughter could light up a room even in the darkest times. He saw their first meeting, awkward and endearing, the way she had teased him for being too serious, too focused on his warrior's pride. He saw the knight he'd proposed, down on one knee in the midst of a battlefield, May laughing as she pulled him up, saying, "Why do you always have to be so dramatic?" Liang staggered back, overwhelmed by the visions. The tree pulsed with energy, and he realized, in a flash of understanding, that it was somehow responding to him, reflecting his emotions, his memories, as if they were woven into the very leaves. "All right, forest. I don't know what kind of trick this is, but," he trailed off, feeling foolish. He was talking to a tree now, and not just any tree, a tree that seemed to know him, to reach into the deepest parts of his heart. He backed away, his mind reeling, but the strange pull toward the tree persisted, and then, he heard it, a soft, lilting laugh, echoing through the clearing like a breeze. He froze, turning slowly, and there, hovering just above the ground, was a small figure cloaked in green, her form translucent but unmistakably alive. She had a playful smile on her lips and a glint of mischief in her eyes, a mix of mirth and wisdom that made her appear both ancient and childlike. Who are you?" Liang stammered, feeling both awe and irritation bubbling up inside him. The figure tilted her head, studying him with a grin. "I am Ing," she said, her voice as soft as a whisper and as sharp as laughter. "The spirit of the soul tree. And you, O mighty warrior, seem to be having some trouble." Liang blinked, caught off guard by her teasing tone. "Trouble? I'm perfectly fine." "Oh, yes, of course," Ing replied, clearly amused. She floated around him, examining him from every angle as if he were some curious animal she'd never seen before. "I can see that from the way you were snarling at the squirrel." "Very dignified." Liang scowled, crossing his arms. "This isn't dignified," he muttered. "This is healing." "Ah, yes, I heard," Ing said, her eyes twinkling with mirth. "That's what they always say when they send broken things into my forest. Go to the soul tree, they say, it will heal you." She rolled her eyes in an exaggerated fashion, mimicking a serious expression. "And here you are, another heart all tangled up in sorrow, pretending you can just walk it off." Liang felt his cheeks grow warm. "I'm not pretending anything. And my heart isn't tangled up in sorrow, as you put it. I'm coping." "Oh, coping, of course," Ing said, nodding solemnly as she floated back to the tree, leaning against it as though it were an old friend. "I've seen many cope just like you, grumbling at squirrels, shouting at the trees. Very heroic." Liang sighed, his anger deflating as he ran a hand through his hair. "What do you want from me, spirit?" "Want from you?" Ing echoed, putting a hand to her heart with feigned surprise. "I'm here to help you, silly warrior. That's what I do. I help lost souls find their way back to themselves." She pointed at the tree. "Every leaf here," she said, her voice growing softer, "holds the memory of a soul that came here seeking something. Healing, forgiveness, peace. Some found it, some didn't, but all of them left a piece of themselves here, woven into the tree's heart." Liang glanced at the shimmering leaves, each one like a tiny, glowing ember in the night. He felt an unexpected pull of curiosity. "All right," he said, trying to keep the skepticism out of his voice. "So, what do I have to do?" Ying's eyes brightened. "It's simple," she said, her tone turning serious. "To heal, you have to see the memories that hold you captive. Each time you look, each time you remember, you'll see things as they truly were, not just the pain, but the joy, the love, the laughter." Liang's throat tightened at her words. He didn't know if he wanted to face his memories of May, not when every thought of her felt like reopening a wound. But something in Ying's gaze softened, a look that felt like understanding, like someone who had seen countless souls struggle as he did. "Fine," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. I'll try." Ying clapped her hands, her expression brightening. "Oh, excellent," she said, clearly pleased. "But there's just one thing." Liang raised an eyebrow, suspicious. "What?" She smirked. "You'll need to pass a few tasks first. Just little things, you know, to help loosen up that warrior's pride. Can't have you all stoic and stubborn while you're here." Liang's groan did nothing to faze Ying. In fact, it seemed to delight her even more. She circled him with that impish grin, hands on her translucent hips as she sized him up, as if assessing his ability to handle the tasks ahead. Liang didn't like it one bit, but he stayed silent. After all, he'd come here for answers, hadn't he? And even though he hated to admit it, he was starting to feel something in this place, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Maybe he owed it to himself and to May, to see this through. "All right, Spirit," he said, straightening his shoulders. "What's the first task?" Ying's eyes sparkled with a mischievous gleam. "The first task," she said, drawing the words out with a hint of drama, "is to let go of that warrior's scowl. Honestly, I don't think I've seen you smile once since you stepped into my forest. It's as if you think the trees will attack you any second." Liang rolled his eyes, but a small, reluctant smile tugged at the corner of his lips. Ying caught it instantly, clapping her hands in triumph. "See? That wasn't so hard," she said. "Now, let's get you doing something a bit more immersive." With a snap of her fingers, Ying conjured a faint mist that settled around them. In the blink of an eye, the clearing transformed. Liang found himself standing by a tranquil riverbank, the sound of rushing water filling the air. He looked around, disoriented. The river, the moss-covered rocks, even the way the sun filtered through the leaves overhead, it all looked achingly familiar. This was where I first met May," he murmured, a strange sense of déjà vu washing over him. Ying nodded. "Yes. I thought it would be a fitting place to start. The riverbank, the flowers, even that ridiculous, oversized fish you tried to catch to impress her. Oh, you should have seen yourself." Liang's cheeks flushed. He remembered that day all too well. May had been washing her hands in the river when he'd gallantly decided to catch a fish, imagining himself as some sort of hero of the wild. But the fish had flipped out of his hands and flopped around on the riverbank, nearly slapping him in the face before escaping back into the water. May had laughed so hard she could barely breathe. He closed his eyes, and suddenly, he was there again. He could almost hear her laughter echoing in the distance, light and full of life. It stung more than he wanted to admit. "So, what am I supposed to do?" he asked, crossing his arms in a feeble attempt to maintain his composure. Ying looked at him with something that might have been sympathy, if she weren't still smirking. "I want you to catch that fish again. But this time, don't try so hard. Just let yourself be in the moment." Liang stared at her, incredulous. "You're telling me to catch a fish for healing?" "Exactly," she said, giving him an encouraging nudge. "Consider it a way to relive the memory. But this time, embrace it as it was, a moment of joy, not just some embarrassing mishap." Liang took a deep breath, rolling up his sleeves. He felt ridiculous, but he waded into the cool water, the sensation oddly grounding. He spotted a glimmer of scales beneath the surface and crouched down, readying himself. In one swift motion, he lunged for the fish, his hands closing around it just as it wriggled free and splashed back into the water. It was exactly as it had happened before, except this time, instead of scowling, Liang found himself laughing, a genuine, hearty laugh that bubbled up from a place he hadn't touched in ages. Ing watched him from the riverbank, smiling approvingly. "See? You do remember how to laugh." Liang wiped a tear from his eye, the laughter subsiding into a bittersweet ache. "She laughed so hard at me that day," he said softly. "I wanted to impress her, but I only made a fool of myself." "And she loved you for it," Ing said, her tone gentle. "Sometimes, we hold on to memories as though they're only filled with pain, but there's joy in there, too." May saw the whole of you, the brave warrior, the fumbling fool, the man who wanted to make her laugh. She loved all of it. Liang felt a knot in his chest loosen, just a little. He nodded, giving the water one last wistful look before stepping back onto the bank. "What's next?" he asked, a small smile still lingering on his face. "Next," Ing said, "we're going to revisit another memory, one that's harder to face. Are you ready?" Liang's smile faded, but he nodded. If he was going to do this, he had to face everything, not just the good moments. Ing snapped her fingers again, and the riverbank dissolved, replaced by the inside of a modest, candlelit cabin. It took him a moment to realize where he was, the small cottage he and May had rented for a few weeks during the early days of their courtship. He remembered those quiet nights, far from the chaos of battle, just the two of them sharing simple meals and stories by the fire, but the scene before him wasn't one of those peaceful nights. Instead, it was the night he'd told her he was returning to the front lines. He saw himself standing by the door, his expression stoic and unyielding, while May's face was a mixture of love and fear. "You're really going back?" May asked, her voice wavering. Liang watched the scene unfold, feeling an all-too-familiar pang of regret. He remembered how he'd brushed off her concern, too focused on his sense of duty to notice the pain in her eyes. "I have to," he heard himself say. "The kingdom needs me." May took a deep breath, steadying herself. "And what about me, Liang? What about us?" The memory of himself paused, searching for words that wouldn't come. Liang felt himself reaching out instinctively, as if he could stop his past self from speaking, but he knew it was futile. The memory played on, with him giving her little more than a nod and an empty promise to return. He hadn't thought about the price he was asking her to pay, the risk she was taking in loving a man who might never come back. Ying's voice broke into his thoughts. "You never really allowed yourself to forgive that moment, did you?" Liang looked down, ashamed. She deserved better. She should have had someone who would have put her first, someone who wasn't so blinded by duty. "But she chose you," Ing said, stepping closer. "She saw the man behind the armor, the one you hide even from yourself. That night wasn't just about you leaving for the war, it was about the sacrifice you both made to love each other, knowing it could be taken away." Liang felt tears prickling at the corners of his eyes. He clenched his fists, fighting the urge to bury the feelings again, to shove them down where they couldn't hurt him. "She believed in you," Ing continued softly. "And she loved you. You don't honor her memory by punishing yourself. She would want you to remember the love, not the regret." He nodded, the weight of those words settling into him. He hadn't been ready to face it, not until now. But here, in this forest with the spirit's gentle guidance, he felt the start of something, a slow acceptance, a loosening of the grief he'd carried for so long. As the scene faded, he found himself back by the soul tree, the leaves still shimmering above him, casting a gentle light over the clearing. Ing stood beside him, watching him with a soft smile. "You're beginning to see it now, aren't you?" she asked. Liang nodded, his gaze fixed on the tree. She's still with me. Even now, she's a part of me. Ying's smile widened. Exactly. Love doesn't end, Liang. It just changes. The pain will ease, but the love, that stays with you, always. He reached out, his hand brushing the bark of the soul tree once more. This time, he didn't feel the sting of loss, but rather a warmth, a gentle presence that felt like May's arms around him, holding him close. As he looked up, he noticed that the leaves had shifted again, glowing with a soft, golden light that filled him with a profound sense of peace. He stood there in silence, letting the warmth wash over him, feeling the love and acceptance that May had always given him, now returned to him through this ancient, timeless tree. Ying watched him, her eyes twinkling with pride and satisfaction. You've come a long way, warrior, she said. But there's one last thing you need to know. Liang looked at her, his heart steady and open, ready for whatever came next. What is it? She stepped closer, her voice barely more than a whisper. The tree, it's not just any spirit. This tree is May. Liang's breath caught, and he felt his heart skip a beat. He stared at Ying, stunned, barely able to process her words. Yes, Ying said, smiling through her own misty eyes. She's been with you all along, guiding you, holding you close even in death. She's found her way back to you, in a different form, but always, always here for you. The realization washed over him like a tide, filling him with a joy he hadn't felt since she was alive. He reached out, placing his hand on the trunk of the soul tree, feeling her presence, her spirit, wrapped around him like a gentle embrace. Thank you, May, he whispered, his voice breaking. Thank you for never leaving me. Ying nodded, watching him with a soft, satisfied smile as he stood there, finally at peace. And there, beneath the shimmering leaves of the soul tree, Liang's heart began to heal, one leaf at a time. The story ends.